Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. Today we're going to cap off this episode looking at the fall of Nero and the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the year of the four emperors, a time of mass civil war for the first time in almost a century. So, we hit on a little bit about how the aristocrats would gain a lot of their wealth through conquest of foreign territories and funneling the wealth of those peoples, cities, and cultures back to themselves, to their own villas, and to their own personal treasuries. Nero attacked this effectively by making sure that this money actually filled the coffers of Rome and not the individual purses of the aristocrats who were closest. This enraged many of them, but Nero took this even further. There were several wars and revolts that broke out while Nero was emperor in Syria, in Judea, in Britain, and in a couple other places. But Nero was very different from a lot of other Roman emperors. He decided to mostly use politicking and diplomatic measures to settle these impasses between the different nations. The war with Parthia, who attempted to grab up part of Armenia, was settled with actually very little bloodshed and quite amicably, to the point where the eastern provinces loved Nero to a very high degree, because when the Parthians were at war and were hostile to Rome, they frequently raided and attacked the eastern Roman provinces. These were the people who were the most susceptible to that, so Nero had propped a lot of them up. Nero had also propped up the average plebe in Rome by giving them, and himself, the Golden House, which was paid for with a lot of the wealth from these conquests and from these battles. But there was one more thing which Nero did, which would ensure that the aristocrats, the overwhelmingly conservative optimates in the Senate, would quell his ability to be an effective emperor and hopefully destabilize and remove him from office. Nero's the coffers of Rome began to run dry with the completion of the Golden Palace, and so he needed a new source of wealth. Rather than going to war, which would have been the typical call, he decided to, in a revolutionary move at the time, tax the aristocrats, the patricians. Now, before this, the average person in Rome, the workers, the laborers, the artisans, those kinds of people, could pay up to 85% of what they made per year in tax to the Roman state. And all that you actually got from paying this high tax load was the Roman military. And you didn't even actually get that as an artisan or a laborer. So you would say, oh, what about the baths? What about the aqueducts and these things? These were constructed by the aristocrats, who paid very little, if any, tax to the state at all, to win favors and votes from the average people, which became much less and less frequent in the time of the empire, because garnering votes meant very little when the Senate did basically nothing. So, Nero decided that he had relieved the pains of the Great Fire, but he also needed to start to gain money. Rather than going to war, he brought up new taxes on the aristocrats. So he effectively attacked them economically on two fronts. One, by stopping them from gaining more wealth and influence through wars, and two, by taking from the wealth that they had accumulated and were sitting on. This was the breaking point. The aristocrats, the optimates, the Senate, all formed coalitions with each other, and they were intent on using deception to dethrone Nero. They never actually had to use violence, so as far as the strategy between the two camps went, the Optimates and the Senate used very effectively coalitions and deception without really having to use violence until a little bit before Nero ended up killing himself. Nero, on the other hand, had no coalitions and had very little means of deception, and as we'll see in a minute, his use of violence would be short-sighted and not strategic in any real way. So, before actual revolts broke out, there was intrigue, and the stated goal of, let's say, the Pisonian conspiracy was to bring back the Republican days, the rule of the Senate over the emperor. The senators and the aristocrats didn't actually want this. They really just wanted to show solidarity with one another and to vie to dethrone Nero and remove any allies that he might have. And in this, they were successful. The Pisonian conspiracy, under the auspices of restoring the power of the Senate, gained many followers in the Senate, and the effective goal was to entrap Seneca, the beloved philosopher and teacher of Nero, in the conspiracy as well. They maintained this goal and achieved it, and Seneca was asked to commit suicide by Nero himself, which was sort of the best form of execution that you could give someone. With this final person killed, Nero also killed many of the conspirators in the Senate, which drove them even further into the arms of those who wanted Nero gone. So, Nero had lost all coalitions available to him. He had no way of making deception, and the limited violence which he had used mostly against aristocrats and patricians made him look mad and not in control of himself. With this, he also lost the last vestige of power which he might have called upon, the Praetorian Guard. They shunned him, they would no longer guard him or even be in the same room as him. With this, the trap was finally set. Several revolts were about to be staged in Gaul, Hispania, Africa, and Germany. This would be the first time that civil war would be on the doorstep of Rome in a very long time. And this, in addition to the extrajudicial, if you want to call them that, killings of various senators and even of Seneca, would lead the mob, who was the last group of people willing to see Nero as a successful or good person, away from him, with the mob no longer in love with the person who had dedicated so much to empowering them. Nero was absolutely alone. Caius Vindex in Gaul, Servius Galba in Spain, and Vitellius in Africa and later Germany all rose to start civil wars, and Nero successfully sent one of his generals, Virginius, to put down the initial rebellion in Gaul, but then his men proclaimed him the new emperor while he was marching back, and even though he didn't really want this title, it was enough for Nero. He tried to seek out friends, someone to talk to him. He was not a warlike person, he had no experience as a general, and he did not see himself able to cope with these civil wars. Unfortunately, he was alone. He went with some servants to a house far away from the city and killed himself. With this, the Julio-Claudian line ended and a massive civil war began, known as the Year of Four Emperors. The first, Servius Galba, came from Hispania, Spain, and marched on the city of Rome itself, installed himself as the new emperor, but the man who was very large in the Pisonian conspiracies and in the actual ousting of Nero in the city of Rome, Otho, didn't like the idea of Galba marching in and making himself king. He raised a legion of veteran troops from the Germanic and British wars and ousted Galba. So Galba's reign was about 3 months. Otho, by unleashing soldiers in the city of Rome, had gone against the age-old rules, and he set the stage for Vitellius, who was actually put into Germany as a governor by the previous Galba to lead his own revolt. Now, it was along the Rhine, so they weren't in Germany, but these were the most expert and the most veteran soldiers. They wanted their guy, Vitellius, to be the king, because Vitellius would then enrich his own men. So Vitellius marched down. He dethroned Otho. But Vitellius went on to spend all of the wealth not on his soldiers, not on allies or on the Senate, but on himself in these massive parades and these really ostentatious displays of a man who seized the title of emperor for little reason other than because he could. There was another general, Vespasian, who had been sent by Nero over to the east to put down a massive rebellion in the Jewish province of Judea, which he was very nearly successful on. He left his son to do the work and finish that up, and he moved down to Egypt with his veteran soldiers from Judea and Syria to gather forces. This made Vitellius quite afraid, who constantly pleaded with Vespasian, but Vespasian would not allow such a opulent person to rule the throne. He moved and made his mark, and he ended the chaos of the civil wars. I just want to go back. Otho actually killed himself as Vitellius marched down because he was afraid of the veteran Germanic soldiers, or he wanted to put an end to the civil strife and thought that by allowing Vitellius to become the champion and the emperor that it would restore order. But this was dispelled, and it was shown that only a very strong leader who was capable of uniting these different areas would be able to do that. That was not Vitellius, unfortunately. It was Vespasian. So, with Vitellius dead, Vespasian still had a lot of work to do. Not only was there still civil war and strife all throughout the empire, there was the fact that the average person in the street was very fond of the previous emperor, even after some of his missteps, and the aristocracy, the patricians and the Senate, were up in arms, all trying to place someone on the throne to give themselves the power of the emperor. This is why I said that the Pisonian conspiracy was very likely not at all to return the power of the Senate to Rome as a governing body, because now that the emperor and the seat of power had been brought about, it wasn't so much that anybody wanted it to go away and to return the old ways. It was more that everyone wanted it for themselves. Vespasian had been in the east, and so had a lot of soldiers, veterans, and people from the eastern provinces on his side. He spent a good amount of time keeping the Egyptian province, especially, in check and bringing them back down from the civil war and strife, because this was where a great amount of the grain was fed up to the city of Rome. There had been an interruption in the grain dole in the Civil War, and many people, average people in the city, had suffered greatly through famine, through starvation, and through other means. This was the first step in restoring the order. The next was that Vespasian had to right the wrongs which Nero had brought about to the ruling classes of the Roman Empire. Vespasian, in contrast to Nero, was a great strategy thinker, and so he used the violence, coalitions, and deception to bring about his own rule and to bring about a new dynasty for the Roman Empire. Vespasian was an optimist at heart, and so he knew that he needed to form coalitions with the old aristocrats and the patricians who felt like they had been burned under the rule of Nero. The first thing that he did was remove the tax structure, which had really started the Civil War to begin with, and reverted a lot of the tax systems back to the way they were. He would come back to this, and we will too, but that's where we're going to start with that. he disassembled the golden house of Nero, and because this would have caused a lot of stir in the lower classes, he replaced it. Now, the golden house actually provided something. It provided a natural escape, it provided art, it provided a sort of escape from the city, but it was a constructive one. It allowed the individual to reflect on themselves, it allowed them to observe beauty and aesthetics, it allowed them into a glimpse of what the aristocrats and the nobles had had for centuries. Vespasian was a very smart guy, and he understood crowd psychology and the way that groups would act. So he replaced the Golden House with the Colosseum. Now, the Colosseum was a callback to the Golden House because it was circular shape, which was a brand new form of constructive layout that had been first implemented by one of the buildings in Nero's Golden Palace. But the Colosseum got large groups of people together to cheer and to chant and to act as a mob in front of people killing each other. This was an out for the inner beast-like qualities of the average person of the mob. It was entertaining for the sake of being entertaining. It was a diametrically opposed form of entertainment to what the Golden House had been, more for placation than for the easing of pain and of grief. This was not where he would stop, however. While Vespasian was in Egypt, he had circulated rumors that he was some sort of god. He was a miracle worker. He had healed people by touching them and done lots of things like this, and he spread these rumors through the four corners of the empire. Now, previously, the imperial cult did sort of revere the emperors, but it was more that they could become gods after they died. Augustus Caesar, while he was alive, wasn't a god, but Julius Caesar was considered one, so he was seen sort of as a child of a god, you could say. This was one of the first times when the emperors would declare themselves a god. This was the second part, in addition to the Colosseum, of how he attempted to control more than to satiate the plebes and the lower castes in Roman society. He had one more trick up his sleeve for them, though. He would give them a massive propaganda campaign. Before the fall of Nero, before the Year of Four Emperors, Nero was mostly seen in a neutral and sometimes positive light. Lots of sources saw the way that he acted, if not in the best of ways, with the best of intentions, up to the Pisonian conspiracy and his killing of many people and himself. This would be done away with. Vespasian had all works of art, all works of literature, all works of philosophy ran through himself and his imperial staffers before it could be disseminated. Everything had to be bad against the old dynasty. The average people did not like the chaos, and they did not like the civil war, but they did like the previous dynasty, so this had to be dealt with. The older emperors, the Julius and Augustus, they could still be sort of revered, but the more familiar ones, who people could actually remember, had to be done away with and had to be slandered as much as possible. Many writers and philosophers would not be okay with this, and they would actually be put to death by Vespasian. He put into system very archaic and brutal methods of suppression by the censoring of art and the killing of philosophers for the first time in Roman history in a few centuries. His rule started the Flavian dynasty, which would last for about 30 years, and set the precedent that a dynasty could be overturned and replaced with a new one. As he was going through these methods, his coffers too began to run dry. He did bring some wealth in from some various conquests, but he needed to bring in more. The tax structure of Nero probably would have appealed a lot to him, but he had needed these taxes removed to keep his coalition with the aristocrats in place. So just real quick, we're going to go over what Vespasian had done thus far. he had renewed coalitions between the emperor and the Senate and Praetorian guards. He had used deception against the mob in order to keep them placated and unwilling to do much about what was going on with his transition into power. And he used strategic violence, not against people who were capable of violence against him, but violence against thinkers, artists, and people who could influence the masses. He had also used deception in the way of calling himself a god, and he had also formed coalitions with several leaders and military aristocrats. So in this sense, he was a very good strategic thinker, and he did manage to use the basic elements of strategy to dethrone his opponent and to uplift himself. He needed, as I said previously, new taxes, and rather than ratcheting them up on the people who had previously revolted, he did so on the lower classes. Just about everything ended up being taxed under Vespasian, and when I say everything, I mean literally everything. This guy came up with taxes for people using restrooms in the city of Rome. And there was a saying, something like, money doesn't smell, so you could get it from all sources. It was a very lively time, but the destruction of Nero's golden palace had to happen in order to reclaim that land for his aristocrat coalition and to erase what Nero had done from the memories of the people. Unfortunately, the mob was quite unforgiving, and once placated with their new source of entertainment, totally forgot about Nero. And to this day, we still read the sources, which were quite obvious propaganda against these later emperors, and see them as evidence of their failings and of their insanity. But I would put up the question that just because you were incapable of fighting a physical war, does that really mean that you were incapable of proper governance? No, I don't think so. Nero, his artistic style, lived on through the Colosseum, through the Pantheon, and through many other artistic sources, and once philosophers and writers had settled down and the propaganda campaigns had stopped, it was much more easy to look back on these things with a more scrutinizing eye. Unfortunately, a lot of them didn't, and the persecution of philosophers under Vespasian would continue for some time. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. This is the end of our episode looking at Rome. Like I said, we're going to come back, we're going to look at a military history, but I wanted to get the political and the social aspects out of the way so that we can understand a little bit more when we look at the way that these militaries and these personalities clashed, what it would have taken to bring that back to the public and to the city of Rome. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like. If you want to see more like this in the future, make sure to subscribe. If there's anything that you want to see more of, less of, you think I did wrong, you think I did right, feel free to leave a comment below. So, until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.